Hello, hello, and welcome to my podcast, Rachel Makes It Weird. This being my first episode, I'd like to talk a bit about who I am, why I wanted to start this podcast, what you can expect from it, and why you should tune in. So, yes, hi, I'm Rachel Hodges. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm a 47-year-old woman with an incredibly thoughtful and nurturing husband named Josh, a middle school-age daughter, Zoe, who is both sweet and snarky, and a high school-age son named Silas, who is a huge Beatles fan and on the autism spectrum, and 2 dogs, Buster and Ruby, who are small, snuggly, and in constant competition with each other. Career-wise, I've done a lot of other things. I've been a nanny, served as a missionary in 3 countries, worked in retail, was a teacher's aide in preschool and kindergarten, volunteered as a youth group leader, taught life skills to kids with special needs, worked as a sort of counselor in a group home for adults with mental health disorders, sold real estate, and have been a stay-at-home mom and writer. I wrote a novel called Gingerly that was published in 2019. Here's the plot in a nutshell. Caitlin McIntyre is 1 year out of a bad marriage, 2 weeks late on rent for her crappy apartment, and 3 days from losing her job. The redhead from Vermont thought she'd gotten past the tragedies in her life when she escaped to beautiful St. Simon's Island after her divorce. But Caitlin's curls, piled into a tangled frizz in the oppressive Georgia heat, are as unmanageable as her life as she finds herself facing not only unemployment, but also having to give up the sewing business and life she'd fought hard to establish. Her fears are allayed when Nick, a real estate developer on St. Simon's Island, is in sudden need of a nanny for his autistic son. But the chemistry between Caitlin and Nick adds to Caitlin's problems, especially when the rumors of Nick being a womanizer appear to be true. Over the course of 2 years, Caitlin takes on an anxious preschooler, a foreign exchange student, the entitlement of the wealthy, and her growing attraction to her boss. Caitlin is an uplifting and often humorous novel. Gingerly is an uplifting and often humorous novel about the paths women must take to find their identity and build a life they're proud of. I'm very proud of the fact that I wrote a book, yet for some reason I always feel a little embarrassed talking about it. You can find it on Amazon if you're interested. I'm currently working on 2 other novels that tie into Gingerly, but honestly, I've had a long dry patch where writing fiction has just been really, really difficult for me. Part of the reason is because there were some challenging things I was going through. Going through those things and having to process them made it difficult to fully immerse myself in the imaginary life of someone else. Writing fiction when your heart isn't into it is possible, but it's like slogging through wet snow. I don't particularly like slogging through wet snow, so I'll wait until the weather clears a bit more to finish what I started. Which brings me to one of the reasons I wanted to start this podcast. I want to continue writing, of course, and I think telling stories about things that have happened to me or to people I care about is going to really help me develop my craft and keep me in practice until I'm able to knuckle down and finish those novels. I was recently talking about my new podcast venture with my mother, and she was urging me to use my storytelling skills to use creative license to make the podcast more interesting and funny. To embellish. While I appreciate the suggestion, it quickly became clear to me that that's not what I want to do. Embellishment is unnecessary if the truth is interesting enough to start with. Besides, sometimes truth really is stranger than fiction. I think my life experiences and things I've seen are sensational enough. So I want you to know that, in as far as I am aware, everything I share here really happened. Names and places may be changed to protect the guilty, but I'll try to give you a heads up if that's the case. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll be seeing footage of me sewing. I thought you might enjoy seeing some of my sewing and craft projects instead of watching me checking my notes and trying to stay on topic. Honestly, I just love making stuff, and I'm hoping that watching me create will add another layer of interest to this podcast. As you may be able to tell, I'm outfitting the doll collection my daughter and I share with Regency-themed clothes. Think Jane Austen and Bridgerton. I have read all of Jane Austen's books multiple times. My favorite is Pride and Prejudice, followed closely by Emma and Sense and Sensibility. The pattern I'm using here is called Eleanor, and it's by Pemberley Threads. I used a separate pattern for some of the sleeve variations. Besides the fact that many of their patterns are named after Jane Austen characters, I enjoy using Pemberley Threads patterns because the directions are straightforward and historically accurate. I purchased these patterns on Etsy, and I'll include the link below. I'm using lace trim I purchased from Little Corner Supplies, also on Etsy. I like them because they are affordable and based in Orlando, which isn't too far from where I live. I like to support small businesses and shop locally whenever I can. I'm not receiving any products or compensation for talking about them. I just really like their products. I sew clothes and quilts for humans as well, but I love sewing for dolls because the projects are small and manageable, and because I'm low-key obsessed with American Girl dolls. I'm constantly on the lookout for dolls to fix up and give a home to. I currently have a beat-up bald Addie doll on top of my dresser. Here, let me show you. Who needs to be restuffed, restrung, and rewigged. Hopefully, I'll have given her a makeover by my next episode so you can see how pretty she really is. I realize that having doll carcasses strewn about my home, like it's Frankenstein's laboratory, comes across as weird, which is totally the point of this podcast. Here you can watch me indulge in my hobbies and create something while listening to a true story or my thoughts on something, which will inevitably be infused with a healthy dose of weirdness. I recently told a friend the title of my podcast, and she said, "But Rachel, I don't think you're weird." It came from a good place, but it kind of hurt my feelings because I view weirdness as an asset. A world full of conformity would be boring. Seriously, who wants to be normal? For too long, weirdness has had negative connotations among the general public, but not for me. In my home, weirdness has always been something to be celebrated. Some are born weird, some achieve weirdness, and some have weirdness thrust upon them. In my family's case, we seem to be cursed with it, or at least our hands are, which brings me to the curse of the weird hand accidents. Some families leave their descendants jewels or titles or land. My family's enduring legacy seems to be that our hands are cursed. Okay, so the whole curse thing is highly debatable, but I think you'll agree by the end of this episode that a lot of weird things have happened to my family's hands. Growing up, I couldn't help but notice that neither of my grandfathers had normal fingers. My grandpa Tom was missing the ring finger of his left hand. My grandpa Warren was missing about half an inch of fingertips on his right. His fingernails were cracked and yellow and curling over where the tops of his fingers used to be. My grandpa Tom lost his finger while working as an airplane mechanic in World War II. The plane was grounded when he idly slipped his finger through a ring on a string that you pulled to open a door. His finger got stuck and he gave it a tug, which caused the door to fly open with such force that his finger was completely degloved. He had to have it amputated because there was really no way to reattach the skin and muscle to the bone. He got the rest of the day off, but had to report for duty the very next day. Very sadly for him, he had been a skilled violinist, but after the accident, his hand stiffened up and he couldn't play well anymore. He wrote to his fiancée, my Grandma Dot, that he wasn't a whole man anymore and that she could end the engagement if she wanted. But she wouldn't let him off the hook that easily. They were married over 50 years. My grandpa was such a sweetheart, it makes me sad to think he could have ever felt less than whole, even for a minute. He had other weird things happen to him, like getting the tip of his tongue struck by lightning and having 2 bees fly up his nose to meet in the middle and sting him there. But these are stories for another time. He never thought to get any compensation for his injury, but when he was retired and visiting the VA hospital, the staff there suggested that he look into it. Decades after the injury, he formally reported it, and the government gave him a stipend of $90 a month for the rest of his life. That doesn't seem like that much, to be honest, but the amount of money did go further in that time. My grandpa Warren lost his fingertips while trying to sell his car. He started the car, but the fan wouldn't turn, so he gave the blades a little push to get it going. At that moment, the fan whirred to life and sliced off the tips of his fingers, just clean off. Needless to say, he did not sell the car that day. His grandfather, Bernard, a Norwegian farmer in North Dakota, also fell victim to a weird hand accident with much grimmer results. He got his hand stuck in a piece of machinery and lost 4 fingers. Still, the chores had to be done, so once he'd healed enough, he hitched up the horses and wrapped the reins around his neck to compensate for his hand. One evening, he went out to plow and never came back. His family set out searching for him. My grandpa Warren found his body by tripping over it in the dark. He was only 13. His grandfather Bernard hadn't been able to untangle himself when the horse bolted and he was dragged or strangled to death. I often wonder if that's when my grandfather decided farming wasn't for him. He ended up becoming a minister, which was less risky. Well, with that cheerful thought, let's follow the curse on over to my father. He likes to joke about breaking a finger when someone punched him in the nose, but he has had some pretty intense hand injuries too. One notable story took place around the time of my sister's wedding. My parents ran a campground along the Connecticut River, and it flooded, coming up over the banks and wreaking havoc with the docks. Some of the campers' boats came loose and were carried away by the current. While trying to save a boat, my dad's hand was crushed between it and a dock. My dad is a musician, and we were worried he'd never be able to play guitar as well, but his hand eventually healed, just not in time to play guitar at my sister's wedding. I remember that while I was growing up, he always seemed to be cutting his hand or smashing a finger, and I got nervous for him every winter when he'd chop the firewood, but fortunately nothing ever came with that. He didn't have any more noteworthy hand accidents for a while, and I was starting to believe the curse had maybe lifted on him, but a few weeks ago he was on top of a tall ladder drilling into a board when he forgot to move his finger out of the way. He drilled a screw right through the board and into his index finger. Unable to free himself, he climbed down the ladder with the board still attached to his finger, and he had to be careful not to drop the drill he was holding in his other hand. Once on the ground, he switched the direction of the drill and pulled the screw out the way it had gone in. Ugh, sorry, I just feel a little sick thinking about that. The family curse doesn't just affect the men, unfortunately. My Aunt Janice once sewed through her hand during a high school home ec class. If I remember her telling the story correctly, she had to manually reverse the hand wheel until the needle came back out. My husband has also been afflicted by the family curse. Shortly before we started dating, he was working as a mechanic at a ski resort and got the finger of his glove stuck in the belt system of the ski lift. I'll spare you the gory details. Suffice to say, one of his middle fingers is now quite a bit shorter than the others. My mom felt sorry for him and got him a finger puppet so he could better express himself in traffic. It's shaped like a chicken, so he can literally flip people the bird. When people ask him about his hand injury, he likes to tell them he got it while trying to artificially inseminate an alligator. Mindful of our dark family history, I have always been careful around sharp objects. I thought maybe the curse had skipped over me because my husband lost part of his finger, like he took one for the team, but my luck eventually ran out. One day when I was worrying away at my sewing machine, I somehow managed to drive the sewing needle right through the base of my fingernail, through the skin and muscle and bone, and out the other side into the metal feed dogs. I was pinned to the spot like a beetle in a bug collection. I don't even know how that happened because there really isn't that much space between the needle and the needle plate, and I have large hands. Getting my pudgy fingers into that tiny space is actually kind of difficult to do, and I'd managed it without even trying. It's like Final Destination, but for fingers, and no matter how careful or safe my activity was, fate had it in for my phalanges. My kids were toddlers at the time and were playing a few feet away from me, but once I got stuck, they wandered into the kitchen and started rummaging through drawers and trying to climb up on the counters. One of the last times they'd been in the kitchen unsupervised, baby Zoe had somehow managed to get up on the counter, open our coffee grinder, and feed whole coffee beans to herself and your 2-year-old big brother. This all happened in a matter of minutes while I was in the bathroom. Fortunately, the grinder was unplugged, or she too may have fallen victim to the curse of the hand accidents. Anyway, we were hosting a foreign exchange student at the time, this amazing girl from Belgium named Renhilde. By the way, she just came to visit us in November, and I already miss her so much. But back to the story. So her room was on the other side of the wall from my sewing machine, so I began banging on the wall with my free hand and yelling, "Renhilde!" She didn't answer, and I was starting to panic because I didn't know what the kids were up to in the kitchen. I was afraid they'd find something sharp to play with or turn the stove on. I couldn't get my hand free, so I unplugged the machine and tried to carry it with me, still attached to my finger, into the kitchen, but that hurt so bad I thought I was going to faint, so I had to set it right back down. Through all of this, I was screaming for Renhilde to come help, and I was beginning to imagine she was ignoring me, and I was starting to get really mad at her when she came dancing out of her room with her earpods in. She was startled to see what I'd gotten up to and was like, "Rachel, how did you even do that?" Which was not helpful. But she did keep Silas and Zoe out of trouble so I could focus on freeing myself. I tried to manually rotate the needle up, but that just made it worse. I plugged the machine back in and very slowly put it in reverse until the needle came back out. I actually had to pull a couple stitches of thread all the way through my finger, which really hurt. While the needle was stuck in my finger, the pain was manageable, but once it was out, I felt just nauseous from the pain. I'd been planning to go skiing with my husband the next day, but my finger really hurt, and I figured clutching a ski pole in the freezing cold would only make it worse. Besides, if I'm uncoordinated enough to punch a hole in myself while sewing a dress, imagine the damage I could do careening down an icy mountain on skis. It took weeks for my hand to heal, and I had a really gnarly-looking fingernail for a while. But back to the whole curse thing. There's no real reason to think we're cursed. There's no family story of one of my ancestors wronging someone who said, "A pox be upon you and all your appendages." I suspect that the only thing getting passed down here is good old-fashioned ADHD. We just don't pay enough attention to our surroundings. I know I don't. I've walked face first into stop signs while lost in thought, or a book. Reading while walking. Don't try it at home. I called my mom and asked if she'd ever had any weird hand stuff happen to her hands, and my father piped up to say that she'd had sticky fingers. Apparently, my straight-laced mother used to shoplift when she was a teenager. She nicked a copy of Steal This Book by Abby Hoffman. I was curious about the book she stole, so I looked it up, and it teaches you everything from how to get free stamps to making Molotov cocktails to escaping from prison. Interesting, the things you learn about your parents. Speaking of sticky fingers, I accidentally absconded with Josh's wallet after only a few weeks of dating. It was one of the most embarrassing moments of my life, and I looked totally guilty, but luckily for me, he was really smitten. If he'd been a little less smitten and a little more clear-eyed, there would be no way he wouldn't have seen this as a huge red flag. Here's what happened. We'd spent all afternoon at Josh's apartment in Massachusetts watching reruns of The Muppet Show. He cooked me an amazing dinner, and then I got ready to make the hour-and-a-half drive back to my apartment in New Hampshire. I threw my stuff into my jean purse, kissed him goodbye, got in my car, and drove away. I was almost halfway home when my car began making a really unhealthy noise, so I pulled over and called Josh. He hopped out of bed, drove to me, and tried to start the car, but it just wasn't happening. He wanted to call a tow truck, and I sheepishly admitted I was kind of broke. He very gallantly offered to cover it. When the tow truck arrived, Josh reached into his pocket for his wallet, and it wasn't there. So he checked the pocket on the other side, and then his back pockets. He figured maybe it had fallen out, so he traced his steps back to his car and looked around in there for a while, and finally returned to me and the truck driver to say there was no sign of his wallet, and he must have forgotten to grab it in his haste to come to my rescue. By that time, I remembered that I did have a credit card for emergencies. I just forgot about it because I had never used it. and I rummaged through my bag to find my wallet, but I pulled out Josh's wallet instead. There was this awkward silence, and both Josh and the tow truck driver were looking at me like, this is interesting. And I was staring at the wallet and stammering out that I had no idea how that got there, which was the truth, but I knew it looked bad, and I just knew my boyfriend wasn't going to believe me. So I'm sure I began looking and sounding even more guilty. I was starting to feel like maybe I was a kleptomaniac, and if I just tried a little harder, I would remember actually stealing it. It was one of those moments where you really want to go to sleep and wake up when it's over. I just knew he was going to dump me because I wouldn't have believed me, and I was starting to feel very forlorn because he was perfect for me and the best boyfriend I'd ever had, and he had to think I was stealing from him. Luckily, he did believe me, though I'm pretty sure the tow truck guy didn't. Long story short, my future husband announced he'd pay for the tow truck and whatever it cost to fix my car. He said I could pay him back if I really wanted to, but to consider it a gift. The repairs cost way more than either of us expected, but he insisted. Okay, I just have to say here that I ended up being really lucky because in the past I've had some relationships that involved big gifts and over-the-top gestures, which led me to feel obligated to stay in the relationships when they turned a little sour. Also, at the time my car broke down, I was about 30 and I really should have been better prepared for emergencies. That being said, it was easy to recognize that Josh was a really well-intentioned, trustworthy guy who simply wanted to help me out with no strings attached. I did insist on paying him back in installments, but I never made it past more than $100 or $200 because we fell into even deeper smit and decided to get married the next month. Kids, do not try this at home, but that was within 3 months of our first date. Some people assumed it was because I was pregnant. I wasn't. And some people were concerned that we were rushing in, which I completely understand. I would feel very worried if someone I cared about decided to marry someone they'd only recently started dating. To misquote Queen Elsa from Frozen, you can marry a man you just met. That being said, we were both much older than one of those Disney princesses, and we'd both been in enough relationships to have a pretty good idea what we wanted. I'm still not sure how his wallet got into my purse, but I think it must have been on the coffee table under something of mine and just got swept in with my stuff. 16 years and a couple of kids later, his heart and wallet are still mine, so all's well that ends well. You may be wondering how we met, or you may not be. You may be wondering if you should find another podcast that actually teaches you something. Whatever you are wondering, I will tell you. My husband and I met on Match.com. I lived in a really rural community with a small population, and there just weren't many ways to meet guys, or someone a friend hadn't already dated or that you weren't already related to. Josh was originally from Georgia and had just moved to Massachusetts for work. I'd noticed his profile on Match.com, but hesitated to reach out because at the time we were of different political persuasions, and that was a lot more important to me than it probably should have been. His tagline was housebroken and has all his shots, which I thought was adorable. Anyway, he contacted me first, and we sent a lot of emails back and forth and talked on the phone a few times before we decided to have dinner at a restaurant near where I worked. I suggested he park at my workplace because parking was kind of expensive in that town. I worked at a group home for people who were mentally ill, and I loved that job. I wasn't working there that day, but I told him I'd meet him there because, free parking. I'm a cheapskate, and I hate paying for stuff if I can get it for free. Unfortunately, I was running a few minutes late, as usual, so he got there first. He parked his car and waited outside while my colleagues and some of the clients stared out the windows at him. He looked up at them, wondering which one of them was me. My roommate also happened to work there, and she felt sorry for him, so she went out to tell him I was on the way. He felt better, but was still feeling unsettled by the sight of everyone watching him from the windows. One of the people staring suspiciously down was a male coworker, let's call him Frank, who had been hitting on me until I invented a boyfriend to deter him. I had let him think Josh was that boyfriend, even though I was just going to meet him for the first time that day. and I had asked Josh beforehand to please act like he wasn't meeting me for the first time and kind of go along with the ruse. He felt weird about that, and he told me he'd rather not. And I felt embarrassed, which I should have. I shouldn't have asked someone to lie for me. And he felt bad about making me feel bad, so he had brought with him some very nice chocolates to make it up to me. Again, he didn't need to do that, but I really appreciated the gesture. So I get there about 10 minutes late, and Josh is very cute, and he's thinking I am also very cute, and he gives me the chocolate, and some of the chocolates are flavored with Earl Grey tea. I love Earl Grey, and I love chocolate, so he is scoring points right and left. And we go for a walk, and we're just looking at each other, and I realize I'm an inch taller than him, and then I realize I don't care, because everything about this guy is nice with a capital N. And we go out for dinner, and we're making great conversation, when something happens that always happens when I get excited and happy, which is I have to pee. A lot. Pretty soon, Josh starts noticing that I'm running to the bathroom every few minutes right after every few bites of food. I'm full of happiness and, well, piss, because I think I found my person, and he's starting to wonder if I might be bulimic. Yes, he thinks I keep running back to the bathroom to make myself vomit every bit of food I'm eating. The fact that I keep popping breath mints into my mouth, just in case he might try to kiss me later, is not helping to dispel that belief. Fortunately, he's also feeling the romantic vibes and decides that whatever is the matter with me, he will just get over it because he really likes me. After dinner, we wander around town for a couple hours and mosey through an art museum, and we've pretty much been inseparable ever since. He is still my favorite person, hands down. And that's saying something because my kids are absolutely amazing. Okay, I got sidetracked. I went from weird hand accidents to finding my person. Please tell me in the comments or email me about any weird accidents you've had or unusual things that seem to run in your family. I'd love to hear any interesting date stories you'd like to share too. Ooh, that reminds me of the time I got distracted talking to Josh and lost a company vehicle. It got reported as stolen and everything. This story can wait for next time. I think that's enough for today. I'll catch you next week, my friends. In the next episode, I will be talking about some of my encounters with weirdos. I have enough bizarre things strangers have said to me to fill a coffee table book. I attract weirdos. I really do. If you are listening, I'm afraid that says something about you. You must be a weirdo too. You should stick around because clearly we are operating on the same wavelength. Stay tuned, stay weird, and stay beautifully you. Until next time.